Start? I think we'll start with one past. Okay, so we are 1 past the hour. We can start the meeting. Welcome everyone. This is the IETF115 meeting for the co-working group. I'm Marco Tiloca, my co-chairs are Jaime Jimenez and Karsten Bormann. Before starting the actual meeting, I quickly share an external slide, if I can share my screen. All slots are taken, good point. That's just to convey some good news that most of you probably already had. Huge congratulations to Francesca and Christian for newborns. Indeed, thanks a lot also for providing likely future working group chairs and ADs and or minute takers. Yeah, as it fits. Congratulations indeed. So back to business. Right, as usual, we assume people here, especially contributing to discussions, to have read the documents in the agenda for today. Let's try to make good use of our time with some discussion. And as it comes in the next slide, not well applies. Please, even if on site, sign in with the Meet Echo app to be sure you are taking the blue sheet. The chairs will keep an eye on the chat, and we have 2 volunteers for the note takers, Bill and Ricard. Thank you very much. Anyone else is more than welcome to further help out. Yes, and as an official IETF meeting, the note will apply. So note them well. Be familiar with that. If you're not, it's not just about IPR patents and so on. It's also and especially about our code of conduct. So be nice and professional to each other. Yeah, a few practicalities if you're not used to that already. It doesn't really change much from the recent past for online attendees, but for people on site, again, be sure to sign in the session with the Meet Echo tool. And if you want to go to the mic, please be sure to first join the queue and then go to the mic and then leave the queue as well. You may also ask to relay a question. If it's better for you, just type it on the chat with mic prefixed. This is the agenda for today. We'll continue this chair slot with a document status update. Then we have updates about the href document, conditional attributes, and the new document on a potential target attribute registry. Then we enter into a series of security works, group of score, the profiling of a key establishment for co-append score, and key update for OSCORE, meaning kudos. And we conclude with 2 slots covered by a single presentation about the DNS over COP document in core and the companion document about encoding DNS messages in CBOR. Does anyone have any bashing for this agenda? Heard and reading none. Then we can go on with document status. And we had the problem details document now published as RFC 9220. That was indeed a big achievement, also done in a pretty much record time. And I believe Karsten can provide a little bit more context also on related work also happening in HTTP-BIS.
Yeah, just a quick piece of information. This draft problem details actually is a knockoff from RFC 7807, which is solving the same problem for HTTP and JSON. So this is the CoAP CBOR analogy. We didn't copy it wholesale because constraint systems are a bit different. So there were some changes, and we would have loved to use the new version of 7807, but that is only completing now. So this is pretty interesting. So, well, the IETF last call just finished, but I think if you find something broken in there, they still want to know that. So if you want to have a look at this, this would be useful. And well, one interesting thing is that to register these problem types, you need identifiers. And the question is, where do these identifiers come from? And we have decided they come from IANA. So if you want to get an identifier, you go to IANA and register it there. And this should be sufficiently low overhead that you can do it. And in this draft, the idea is that you essentially can forge your own IANA URIs as dereferenceable identifiers. So we have integers. The original or the updated original draft now has IANA URIs, and this is starting an interesting discussion. It's probably more an area general thing about dereferenceable identifiers going into the IANA registries. But yeah, if you're interested in this kind of thing, you may want to have a look. Yeah, the one thing that I'm not going to detail is that this RFC contains 3 pieces of Hebrew text, which took us about 2 months to actually publish in an RFC.
Thank you, Carsten. Yeah, moving on, we have one document in ISG processing, course seat now in version 19. It's formally an AD follow-up. There is plan to have further discussion already during the IETF week with other people involved in CoreConf, and have it covered also the later interim meeting planned for December. But I believe this document can be wrapped up pretty soon to take the next step to publication. We have a number of documents that are after the working group last call. Komai and Young Library are also part of the CoreConf cluster. They were put on ice, waiting for the other 2 CoreConf documents to be completed first. So these are also supposed to be taken up soon too. We also have the group on score document in Shepherd write-up, which is in the agenda for today following an update happened before this cutoff. As to other documents, we have 2 currently in working group last call, conditional attributes that got updated we have in today's agenda, and group combis that is waiting for a second wave of comments or confirmation to come following the first one. We have also adopted DNS over COAP after summer. It's also in the agenda for today. And there's a document, group com proxy, a pending working group adoption call. And a number of other individual documents were also resubmitted before the cutoff, not in the agenda for today. Please have a look at those, provide comments on the list. And we had also a brand new individual document that was already resubmitted during the hackathon, basically, and it's on today's agenda, proposing a new registry for target attributes. Yeah, so we can start with the first item. As a recommendation, of course, please be sure to wear your masks. Possible exceptions up to you is if you are at the mic actively speaking and presenting. Thank you.
I demonstrate the right way to use a microphone with a mask. You hold it very close. And unless you have singers training, you cannot do this with a stand. So you always have to take the microphone. So CRIs. The document is called Draft IETF Core href because we couldn't decide on how to call them, but they are now called CRIs. So CRIs are a concise equivalent of URIs and URI references, as we know them from RFC 3986. Next slide. Oh, I can look there. I'm stupid. So the interesting thing is, when you take something that has such a long history as a URI and try to come up with a structured representation of that, you essentially have to build a data model for what information is in a URI. And that's a bit more complicated than maybe meets the eye immediately. And there are some dark corners, and we don't really care that much about those dark corners, but we need to cover them to really make CRIs first-class citizens. So we started to make sure we can do CoAP and CoAP-S. Now that's easy, but yeah, there's some weird stuff. And there are some features, in particular the percent encoding mechanism, that really is at 3 levels at the same time: lexical, syntax, and semantics. So CRIs are a standard structure, are intended as a standard structure for parsed URIs. So you don't need a URI parser anymore. And of course, every one of us has written a URI parser that was about 20% correct. And yeah, this is supposed to be done for you before the CRI hits your constraint device. And of course, the other attempt is to be concise, use less bytes than a URI in many cases. Next slide. So on this conciseness, one contribution to the conciseness is to have integer representation for frequently used scheme IDs, for instance, HTTP, HTTPS, CoAP, and so on. And it's easy to do that for the maybe 10 or so we actually use a lot in the core environment. But of course, we want to do this right to make CRIs as universal as possible. And well, we started out with the idea that we would simply do the complete set in the RFC and not provide extensions. So why don't we want to provide an extension? The problem is if you provide a text encoding for something that can also be encoded as an integer, and that integer comes in later, implementations need to choose whether they use the text encoding or the integer encoding. And they will, of course, look at the deployment situation out there and say only 99.73% actually implement that yet. And I don't want to lose the other 0.37%, so I'm going to use the text encoding. So essentially adding something to a registry after the fact will have no effect in many environments. So that's a problem with just saying, oh, we drop in a registry here and that provides the extensibility we need. Next slide. So the idea is that we limit or restrict the point in time when these registrations can happen to A, the initial prefill of the registry that happens when we publish this draft, and B, to the point in time when a new URI scheme that we couldn't know about at the time the draft was published as an RFC, when a new URI scheme is registered. So that's relatively safe. I mean, the URI scheme is, the new URI scheme is going to be in use in testing and so on. But yeah, it kind of only gets official when the URI scheme is registered and we have early allocation and so on. So that should happen early enough. So we have a wiki where we try to collect data for an initial prefill, and actually the -01 version of this internet draft has a significantly expanded set of items to prefill. So yeah, at some point we will declare victory on this gathering activity. But really the question is whether this is the right way to do. How do we get people who register a URI scheme to actually think about whether they should be registering a number for CRIs as well? I mean, it's not disaster if they don't do it, it's just less efficient. So next slide. During the hackathon, an idea came up, and the reason the idea came up is that the URI scheme registry already had a column added to it in the past. So when well-known URIs needed an indication on the URI scheme whether that URI scheme has well-known URIs or not, a column was added to the URI scheme register, which is defined in 7595, that provides the information. It's essentially a Boolean value plus a reference to the RFC in which this is described. So why don't we just add another column with this number? So people who want to add something to the URI registry and look in there and want to emulate, match the existing entries, they get kind of they get led, nudged to actually register a number if that is meaningful. I mean, registering a number too many is using up our space, but we are talking about 100 permanent URI scheme registrations at this point in time. So before we even leave the first byte, a lot of additional registrations will have to be done. So we don't have a problem with that. So that's really something that we, as a working group, try to prevent. Impinging on somebody else's space and meddling with that. We don't do that. But in this case, it may be worth it, and it's a pretty innocuous thing. So that's what we are currently thinking about, and I would love to get some feedback for that.
There's a comment in the chat from Francesca, or add a note to the IANA registry and make sure IANA asks the question with a pointer to the new registry.
Yes. But yeah, I mean, why have two tables when the information can go into one? So that's the database person envy speaking. Yeah, but we have to discuss what's the best way to do this. But the important thing is that the registry, the IANA page for the registry, contains the information that there is the opportunity to get a number with the registration of the scheme ID. So yeah, but please look at the wiki page that was mentioned on the previous slide and see whether your favorite IoT URI scheme actually is covered. So that's the big one. Well, it's not big, but the largest one. Next slide. And we have a few more issues open that essentially all have a resolution already in the GitHub issue discussion, but the resolution needs to be written up. We plan to have this done before this IETF, but it didn't happen. So the idea is that we will do this now and use the next core interim on November 23rd to finish this up. And of course, a pretty important issue here is having test vectors. So how do people know that their CRI implementation is approximately correct? And of course, we don't want to fill this draft fill the specification with test vectors, but where test vectors actually are illustrating the way CRIs work, we want them in an appendix. So we will make one more round on the test vectors and then select a few to add to the appendix. Next slide. So yeah, the idea is to work a little bit more on it to the next interim. to decide the remaining issues. We submit a -12, do working group last call, and profit. Any comments on that? Nothing on Gemma? Good.
There's comments for you in the chat that are not requesting to be relayed right now, and you can read later. The comment said from Francesca.
Not requesting?
There are comments for you in the chat, not urgent to be
Okay,
the mic,
good.
but you can
Read
read
later.
later.
Yeah. Great. So, Bill, I think you are next.
Thank you, Carsten.
Thank you.
You prefer to share and control yourself, or should
You can control this. Very few slides.
Yep.
Okay, I'm left-handed, so I'm going to hold the mic the other way. Hopefully this works. Hello, everybody. So this is the presentation for a working group document, conditional attributes for constrained RESTful environment. So it's pretty much of a mouthful, but anyway, it's conditional observe pretty much. Now, there's not very many slides here. If you can move it to the next page. So the current status has been that the document has been in working group last call for a while. We received one review. Thanks, Marco, for it. If you're interested in the review, you can click on that URL, and then you'd see how extensive it was. Myself, as the editor, I opened up issues for every little part that Marco remarked upon. So in total, we had about 20 issues that were open on GitHub. 19 are closed, one is still open. Next slide. So the full list of the working group last call review comments are at that URL. You can see them all. Like I said, 20 issues, 19 closed, one still open. The majority of these issues were editorial in nature, so it wasn't very difficult to correct them. One closed issue was just referring to RFC 7252 and RFC 7641 for CoAP and Observe to be normative references and instead of informative. And then one other closed issue was just about a clarification to avoid the draft talking about value changes and transmitting values, and instead considering state representations and state changes. So that was done. There's one open issue still left. It requires a minor code review. I hope that can be done by this week. So that should be closed very soon as well. Next slide. So that's it. Basically, we want to complete the remaining issue. More reviews are always welcome. We've only got one so far. We had some others before we went to a working group last call, but obviously more reviews are always welcome. Now, a question that came up was when I was discussing a little bit more about getting more reviewers, was whether we should request an early review from the IoT Directorate. So I'll leave that to the working group to decide, and the working group chairs, if that's a good idea or not. And that's the only thing I have. The next slide would say thank you, but it might be premature yet. If any questions, I'd be glad to take them.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I heard of a person anyway volunteering to review already, and then I think it's a good idea anyway to request an early review to the IoT Directorate. But I think we should. And Ines, go ahead.
Thank you.
Ines.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, yes, that would be nice to have it at the IoT Directorate. So you basically can click into the button, review request, and then we take it. No problem with that. I can review it as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.
Okay.
Any other comments, anyone?
So if not,
No?
I think we move on to the next
Right.
presentation.
Thanks a lot, Bill.
Thanks. Oh, it's Carsten again.
Yeah,
we are
presentations.
Yes, this is a tech team.
The people. Well, this is a really short one. 2012. We invented this link format thing, which became RFC 6690. And this link format has so-called target attributes. And yeah, now this is coming up again. So about 10 years in the making, this draft. It's already a -01 because, yeah, again, it has an initial set of registrations, and that, of course, is growing all the time. Next slide. So the link format target attributes are really meant to tell you with a link that may be in the resource directory or in the well-known core information, what kind of link this is. Well, that's what the relation says, but also what you can expect to find at the destination of the link. And that's why these things are called target attributes. So we didn't invent this, but took this from the web linking RFC 5988. And that has things like media type. So for instance, for a link, you can get a hint what you're likely to find, what kind of media type you're likely to find at the other end. So you can decide not to use the link if you don't support the media type. And for us in particular, the two target attributes RT and IF were very important. And that's why we put registries for the values of RT and IF into 6690. But we didn't put in a registry for the target attributes because 5988 said this specification does not attempt to coordinate the names of the target attributes, but provides a number of common target attributes like media type for the link HTTP header, which we just copied. So we did not put a registry in 6690. Next slide. So 5988 is 10 years old, and or a bit more than 10 years old, and of course has seen a revision, and that revision 8288 actually now says those creating and maintaining serializations of web linking, and link format obviously is a serialization of web linking, should coordinate their target attributes to avoid conflicts in semantics or syntax, and may define their own registries, because we don't really have a very good way of doing coordination except in a registry. That this is kind of an obvious thing to do now. So yeah, this we should have done this right at the time 8288 came out. For some reason, this didn't happen. But we already had a couple of close calls for people registering attributes, or not registering, using attributes, describing attributes in an RFC or other document that had the same name, and we want to make this less likely. So let's do this now. So the idea is to add a new sub-registry for target attributes in the core parameters registry. So in the IENA documents, you always have a web page, which is the registry. And then in this web page, you have several registries, which are then called sub-registries. The terminology is totally confusing. But anyway, so the policy for this sub-registry would be expert review. So the ISG will select an expert that actually looks at each registration request and maybe helps this request become better by giving some information, and at some point it gets accepted. And we have some instructions to designated experts, and I think these need a little bit more work. So the idea was, well, if somebody registered type or something, you would look whether this was something that is very specific to one ecosystem, one corner of an ecosystem, or whether it's widely used. So this is the frugal thing. And the other thing is what RFC 8126 does not have is specification desired. They have a specification required policy, which says, hey, you have to put a specification in there. And they have expert review, which doesn't say anything about that. And this is kind of in the middle. So we really expect people to do a specification unless there are good arguments not to do that. And there is somebody in the queue.
Let's go in the queue.
You want to go now? Or? Yeah, I'm almost done. Yeah, the other instruction is to use lowercase letter followed by lowercase letters, digits, and minus signs, because the ancestry of these web linking things really are email headers, which were defined in the late 1970s. They are case insensitive. Of course, no sane person would design something being case insensitive at this point, but because of this 45-year ancestry, they need to be case insensitive, and we are just saying you always register the lower case form, so people get nudged to using that and reducing confusion. Next slide. So this is the prefill. As you can see, this has been pretty lively. The href, anchor, rel, and rev are essentially things that are not useful as target attribute names because they have a different meaning in web linking. href, lang, media, and title are defined as target attributes by 8288, so they are also gone. rt, if, size are in the link format document. Content format is in the core document. Ops is in the observe document. JCT, JCT, HCT, HCT is in the HTTP mapping document. OSCORE has target attribute. Okay, that's the published RFCs, and obviously we put the prefill in this document because the RFCs cannot be retroactively changed to the registration. And then we have several drafts that are in flight. And this has two examples for drafts. One is IETF core OSCORE ad hoc, which has half a dozen of target attributes. And yeah, let's see which of the two drafts is published first. And that actually decides where the registration will be made. And draft looker core discovery has another set of target attributes, pretty many actually. And yeah, they since that document is not really in a race to completion with this specification, they probably will be registered there because the target attributes registry should be in place by the time that happens. So we have to manage this prefill, but it's really just clerical work to make sure we have all of them. And again, if you have a target attribute, you know that something in the IETF or some other industry organization, OCF, OMA, uses, we probably would like to know to do this prefill. Next slide.
And we should replace the underscores with dashes.
Yes.
Also in the referred document.
Yes. Yeah, we always have that problem. It's really funny. So ABNF, for instance, doesn't allow underscores in identifiers. And each time you're reviewing someone who's coming in, it's ABNF who's coming in new, they use underscores in the identifiers because their programming languages force them to do that. But ABNF was written by people who were programming in Lisp. where minus signs are normally in identifiers. Anyway, next slide. I have
We
9
have
seconds left.
still Esko in the queue and also Christian. So I don't want they want to jump in
Yeah,
now.
Go ahead.
And no need to rush in general because we are minus 10 minutes.
Okay, very good. Yeah, so first of all, I support this draft and adoption because I think we have hit this issue a couple of times in the past. So that sounds good to have this also pre-filled. And yeah, make it also available to other standards bodies that want to submit their elements with maybe a pointer to their specifications. So it's good. Yeah, the one thing I was just looking at, you mentioned expert review, and I did see that we have currently the process of expert reviewing. Someone sends a request. I recall the last request was in August, and there was no reply yet to it. So it's not a particular quick process as far as I can see. Maybe we did do something, but at least it was not visible on the core parameters mailing list.
Yeah,
So
do you remember what that request was?
Yeah, that was, I think, for one of the standards organizations, like something like OCF or.
Well, I just answered the
else.
global platforms one, which maybe that one, but okay.
Okay, well, it was not. I just checked; it was not in the email archive yet.
Yeah,
maybe it's not answered to the list. That's the problem, maybe. But,
yeah, so we don't really have a good way to get a transparent sequence of messages between the registrant, IANA, the experts, and the working group that actually may be interested in this subject. And right now we usually have bilateral messages, and that doesn't make sense. But it's currently the way things are being done, and I think we need to at some point need to change this.
Yeah, because now a request comes in, but you can't see if it was granted or not, or if anyone responded, for example.
Yeah.
That's not,
so,
clear.
For instance, we might instruct IANA to actually send registration requests to the core parameters list, and ask people to actually CC that list on our communication.
Something like that. Yeah. Okay, but that's something to consider as an improvement then, I think. And a couple of things you mentioned, like the don't use underscores, but hyphens and only lowercase. I think that's also an excellent idea for this. Yeah, thanks.
Christian?
Christian Amsus, does this document, should this document, or do you plan to address the topic of whether the semantics of that attribute pertain to the link itself or to the link target? Because all the examples that I've seen here, except for title as defined in 8288, are about the target independently of the link, whereas other attributes could be about the target when used through that link, or even the link itself, as it was in some iterations of DynLink. Will this document make any statement to that, or will it just talk about the formalities of registering and then leave the semantics as they are?
Well, that's a really good question. I don't think we actually want to change 8288 or
we wouldn't. It would just
60. Go ahead.
It wouldn't do anything about 8288. It would just be about which attributes can be registered. But
yeah, but 8288 doesn't give you a way to add attributes that are not target attributes, if I remember correctly.
No, the terminology is a bit confusing. They are called target attributes, but they describe a property of, quote, the link or its target. So especially one example 8288 gives for title is next chapter, which is only a valid name when following this particular link and not a property of the target resource as a whole.
Okay, but that's just then my mistake of putting title in the second line of this slide instead of the first line. But are people supposed to put in more information that really is about the link and not the target? I didn't read 8288 that way, and that's maybe worth examining.
But the title is an example. The title is an example of that, and the authors generally and I've mailed back and forth with them, assume that it could also be just only about this particular way of accessing that resource, or possibly even the link on its own.
Okay, I think that's really interesting. I hope this doesn't throw a curveball into getting this document out quickly, because I think that's a pretty fundamental question about web linking that we would have to discuss with the HTTP people as well, because we just have copied that part and simplified it a little bit.
And either way, just one more comment on the document registry, or the registry as a whole. Coral will very much want to add a column there that says, and by the way, the mapping is defined like this and that. Independently of what the answer to my first question is, it's just if the answer to the first question is, yeah, it could be any of those, that second column will be a lot more complex.
Yeah, maybe we should get used to the idea of adding columns in registries in a later document. Because we probably know how the race between the target attribute registry and Coral is going to go, and so we can't really have a column in there for a document that isn't done yet. Yeah, but let's discuss this. Good. Yeah, last slide. So this is still an individual draft. We have discussed it, I don't know how often, in the last 10 years, but somebody had to sit down and actually write the thing. That has now happened, and the next step would be to make this a working group document. I think it's pretty clear that this is within our charter, because it's essentially just a maintenance housekeeping activity. But of course, it's always nice to get some confirmation from the ADs about that. And then do some working group work, like answer Christian's questions, do a working class call, and finally profit.
Thank you.
Thomas.
You're a cop?
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'd be happy to open for an adoption call soonish. Is there any objection? I think we can start an adoption call this week.
Great. Perfect.
Okay. Thank you.
So I do your slides now?
Yeah, thanks.
What is the sorting criteria here?
Thanks. Yeah, very well. Okay, hi everyone, this is Marco. This is an update on the Grupos core document. Next slide, please. Yeah, before the cutoff, we submitted version 16, essentially merging a single consolidated PR 98 and covering fundamentally 4 things. Number one is the major one. It was about improving the handling of some particular responses that can happen during the Grupos core communication that we noticed was not completely handled. Number 2 was also a little tweak to do to downgrade the must to a should to not lock down possible cases. While 3 and 4 were extended editorials, if you want, improving the presentation of the security properties of Grupos core to be more aligned with those of OSCORE and the way those are presented, and improving the presentation of the properties of the features that the pairwise mode has and inherits actually from the group mode. We've had an early discussion about this PR with Christian as document shepherd that encouraged us to not wait for his shepherd review and write up before going on with this PR and its merging. Still, of course, we would appreciate further comments from him and others. And he actually realized that especially point one had a more general applicability in the context of non-traditional responses, for which an issue on the corresponding GitHub repo was also opened. And Ricard also, before merging, very carefully reviewed that PR. We're very thankful for that. So eventually we merged that. And I'm mostly going to go through well, basically the content of the PR that was merged in version 16. And for the end, I have a little open point that came up post cutoff, which is also related to the target attribute registry discussed in the previous presentation by Karsten. So next slide, please. Yeah, and I actually start with easy one. Number two, we downgraded a must to a should about the use of the group mode for protecting a group request intended to multiple recipients. We actually had already an exception under our nose for a while. There may be probably more that we're not even imagining now, but that was enough anyway to switch to a should. Next slide, please. Right, on the main thing, handling of multiple responses. I need to bring up some context here why we had to make some fix. This is text quoted from the GroupCom-bis document, and this text has been around for a couple of years now after changes in this direction that were discussed, agreed, and even confirmed later on at IETF115 lastly, and since then the text never changed. Basically, a client sending a group request to multiple recipients, because of that, preserves the token beyond the reception of a first response. And taking advantage of that, in principle, a same server can send back multiple responses, not necessarily as observed notifications. And the idea was to leave the final decision about what to do in that situation to the application at the client and not the stack at the client, since the application of the client can have more context to take a better decision for that particular application, like considering only the very last response from that server or produce some kind of aggregation of those, whatever. So this is the context we had and we consistently built on in Grupo Score. Next slide, please. Yeah, and considering that context, well, we had a problem. Most was okay already, and basically the handling of a single response to a sent request or multiple responses if they were observed notifications. The problem was if a same server sent multiple non-notification responses to a same group request. And then there were two issues due to under-specification. On the server side, there was no text mandating the server to include its own sender sequence number as partial IV in the responses following the first one. So that, of course, opened for aid enhanced reuse. And on the client side, on the other hand, there was nothing really mandating the client to do any form of response ordering enforcement or replay check. And anyway, there were no means to do that because there was not necessarily a partial IV in those responses. So those were the issues. Next slide, please. Yeah, we think we fixed that, basically relying on the same rationale and approach used for handling exactly the same kind of problems for observed notifications, only separately, because we still want observe to be a separate feature optional to support that may not be around or used only by some servers in the group and not all of them. So separately, we define the handling of non-notification responses to group requests, again, using the same rationale used for observed notification. We had to introduce a new term already in the terminology section. We called it non-notification group exchange. I stress the word exchange because it's intended to be an environment like an observation is. So something tied to the group request that the client sent and the non-notification responses that the server sent to that group request. In such a context, we'll have, well, on the server side, including the sender sequence number as partial IV in the responses with the possible exception of the first one, which is good. And on the client side, the client will expect responses to comply with that. And just like a client that sends specifically an observe request considers the partial AV of notifications as a notification number, well, the client will consider the partial AV of non-notification responses as a response number, trivially, and based on that will perform replay checks and ordering of the responses like it happens for notifications. And like it happens for notifications, at most one response from the same server is allowed to not have the partial AV, and that has to be considered the oldest one. Next slide, please. And those are the main points related to the actual message processing. There's a number of side things that, as a side effect, had to be said, but they are exactly like for the case of notification. So if a client and server would like to have this kind of exchange continuing beyond a group rekeying, they have to preserve the KID context, meaning the group ID originally used for the original request, and use it for the external EAD to bind all responses across rekeyings to the same request, just like we do for observe. And similarly, if they want to have this exchange surviving beyond the change of clients and their ID, they need to store and use for the future external ID of responses the original KID, meaning the original sender ID of the client that was used for the group request in question. I mentioned extended editorial revisions in the presentation of the security properties of GroupoScore. Those were, of course, also extended in order to capture the properties that we now have in addition to version 15 in order to cover also this additional new handling. I think this is the last slide on this particular topic. So if there is any comment or question on this, Christian.
Yeah, I didn't quite get why notifications would need separate handling from other requests with multiple responses. So at least in the core responses document, which I'm working on, they could be unified. So why can't they be unified here? With the multiple responses just being a generalization of notifications.
The idea was to keep observe as a separate optional service to support, like it has been so far in OSCORE already, and then in GroupoScore. So if we had to start this from scratch, probably we could have taken that path. Now it means a big restructuring, I'm afraid.
But this feature is not something that is ever negotiated or kind of being technically exchanged. It's just a matter of phrasing, right? So you're keeping the phrasing of the document so that people can follow the one line of phrasing for the notifications and a different line of phrasing for everything else, but then it effectively duplicates text, doesn't it?
Partly, yes, it uses a slightly different terminology to emphasize what is about non-notification responses. So it does draw a line, indeed. And bottom line to stress that observe is a separate service optional to support. So one may not even read anything about observe if not interested in it.
But they would still do effectively the same implementation just by doing the different part and not know that they.
Yes,
I'll have to read the document again, but if it is how I now imagine it is, I don't think that's a good idea. Because the document is not set in stone yet, and I think it would be better to unify it now, even if it's more editorial work than leave it up to the readers to do the unification mentally.
Okay, do you have in mind to propose a pull request?
Yeah, I'll have a look at it.
Much appreciated. Thanks. Is this going to? Yeah.
So yeah, I was just wondering, you mentioned the possibility that the server basically sends multiple responses in this case. I think in group combis we have written that can happen because of somewhat of a faulty server implementation or something, or it's a bug or a malicious server that tries to do something to disrupt whatever is ongoing. But are you considering that the server could just send two responses basically to request just because it thinks, oh, I have some update to send, why not do that? Is that
That's another case. One thing we mentioned already in Group of Greece was the case of a client resending the same request with the same token and same message ID,
Yeah.
and the server not supporting message duplication. But you've just mentioned yet another case.
Yeah, I think the intention was not to support necessarily that case, that the server starts sending multiple responses. It's more like saying, okay, it could happen, for example, due to this datagram getting duplicated, so the server could just send back 2 responses. But maybe it's different if you consider the OSCORE security on top of that. I don't know the details of that, but yeah, it seems to me that it should not be a case that the server would willfully send multiple responses because it's supposed to send only one, right?
Group Combis says depends on the application, and the application on the client will figure out.
Yeah, that's right. The client will figure it out, but the server isn't supposed to do it. That's also the message, I think, or what we try to say there in the draft, because it's not promoting the server to do that. It's just saying that the client should be prepared to handle these kind of cases, right? So the client could also say, I'm just throwing away any second or third or following response with the same token. So.
And that's the application again.
Yeah.
So the client must still be ready to have this happening. And even in the presence of Group OSCORE, you may have an adversary injecting replayed responses.
Yeah, but you could have a client that implements Group OSCORE that already decides I'm only going to accept the first response that comes in, and then that client doesn't want any code for example, for handling future responses with the same token. So that means that maybe part of what you're proposing is not relevant for that type of client, right?
Sure.
So it's more like an option. That's how it sounds to me. Yeah? Like if you are a client that wants to process multiple responses, then yeah, maybe it has to check certain things, but you don't have to do that as a client, right?
Group OSCORE should work in one way, let's say, in a more secure way, regardless of what tolerance the applications have. So if the application had no tolerance, well, okay, then Group OSCORE can be aligned accordingly. But if the application has tolerance, Group OSCORE should enforce the best security possible, meaning being ready to have replays coming and being able to detect them, to stop them, for example.
Yeah, okay. At least deal with duplicates. I agree with that, but I don't know if it should be kind of designed for having a server that necessarily decides to send an updated response later on because hey, there's still time and can send an update. That seems to be going a bit out of the co-op specification that we have. But okay, yeah, I'll think about that. Thanks.
Thank you. And Christian, back also to your comment, probably we are already on the right track for that on the server side, because it is phrased in a general way to say must include a partial V in any response following the first one, regardless of being a notification or not. So probably that's general enough. The big thing is on the client side then.
Christian, you want to join the queue and mention what you're writing on the chat briefly?
I can just repeat it quite briefly. Yes, I agree that if a client doesn't solicit multiple responses, then it can just take a simple processing for one response, and that's either valid or not. But there can be multiple ways in which a client would solicit multiple responses, observe being one, group proxying might be another, and whatever that is, if it solicits them, then there is a way of processing them. So that's both to the earlier discussion and to Esko's question.
Yeah, and this probably would come back again the moment you consider proxies supporting groups, because they will send back multiple responses to the same request to the client. Okay, so we would expect some more detailed input from you, Christian. Christian?
I'll bring that in as part of my review, yes.
Thanks a lot. Okay, next slide, please. And it's a final one, in fact. Yeah, about target attributes. When working on that PR, we know that, as Carsten mentioned before, the OSCAR RFC defines an OSC target attribute to signal that a resource is accessible using OSCAR and should be accessed using OSCAR. Of course, it didn't mention group OSCAR. There's something that looks like missing, so we would propose to define in the group OSCAR document a new similar target attribute GOSC to indicate that the resource is accessible using OSCAR and or group OSCAR. So very similar. Of course, we need to be supportive of all the implementations that may retrieve a link to such a resource, but they don't support specifically group OSCAR and the target attribute GOSC. So we could think of these rules of use so that if the link specifies GOSC, it must specify also OSC. And well, an old device not understanding group OSCAR or GOSC would ignore GOSC because it doesn't understand it after all, and it's not interested in group OSCAR. But if it does understand group OSCAR and GOSC, it will focus on it and ignore OSC because it's practically overshadowed by the statement from GOSC. Any comment or objection on defining a target attribute like this way? And it can be also one more addition for the pre-filling of the registry in Carsten's draft. Okay, and the next slide should be really the wrap up. We can submit of version 17 anyway, adding the new target attribute. And then we wait for more input and review from Christian for the shepherding. That's it. Thank you indeed.
Okay. Yes, so I will be presenting this draft profiling ad hoc for COAP and OSCAR. And yep, slide changing works. So just as a recap, what is this about? Well, we have ad hoc, which is a lightweight authenticated key exchange being developed in the Lake Working Group. And its main use is basically establishing an OSCAR security context. However, normally when you run ad hoc, it will take you 2 round trips before you can start using OS Core. So what this document proposes, and the main contribution of this document, is an optimization to this procedure where when you send your ad hoc message 3, you actually combine that with an OSCAR protected application request. And you can do that because at that point, you already have a valid OSCAR context to use. There are other parts also in this document specifying some other details like OSCAR specific processing of ad hoc messages, consistent extension of the ad hoc application profile, web linking, and some performance considerations on blockwise. And well, what updates have been done since IETF114? Well, version 05 has been submitted. There will be no big changes to the fundamental mechanics of this optimized workflow. We did make some modifications to Diana considerations regarding shortening the text and only like narrowing it down to option number 21. Previously, we considered other numbers too. We have renewed the early registration for option number 21, which will now expire the 8th of November 2023. And as far as these performance considerations on blockwise I mentioned, basically we restructured that a bit, so we moved some of that down to an appendix in Appendix A. It's now still the same content as used to be in Section 6. And to kind of summarize our conclusions from that is basically that if you have to use blockwise specifically because you're using this optimized workflow, meaning this combined request becomes so big you have to use blockwise, then this optimization has no performance benefit, and you might as well use the original normal ad hoc workflow because it's less complex, and since the optimization doesn't give you any benefit in that case, just use the normal ad hoc. We also expanded then the security considerations. So basically, there are some considerations now about like access control, because you have to consider that you may have access control also involved. And the fact that is like, just because you complete ad hoc with another peer, that doesn't mean you get any specific resource access. That still has to rely on the normal access control procedures that you're using. Otherwise, we have some information now about that, like, let's say you have access control information, how and what information may need to be provided before the ad hoc execution. Yeah, basically more considerations on this part about access control. Now, what happened after the cutoff? Well, we actually defined in Section 6 some target attributes for ad hoc resources. And basically, so now these attributes can be registered in this upcoming ANA registry, and that's defined in this new draft by Karsten. And I think that was mentioned a little bit, but the proposal here is that in this new draft from Karsten, we pre-fill the new registry with the target attributes from this document, but we still ask for registration also in this actual document. And then basically it's like a race between the two documents, which get there first, and the one that gets there first gets to keep the text, the other one, the text is removed. Yeah, sorry, that was opposite, yeah. The one that, yeah. Anyway, so, well, regardless, we may want to also revise the names of the attributes, like starting with some kind of prefix that shows that these are specifically related to ad hoc. Yeah, and of course, any thoughts or objections or comments on this plan is very welcome. Yeah, I go to the next one. So we had a proposal from David Navarro. So this is also being tracked in a pull request at in the GitHub repository. And basically, he noted that in one of the figures we have, we do not include a response to the ad hoc message 3. And he then suggested, okay, why don't you add ad hoc message 4 in that figure just to make it clear that ad hoc message 4 can in fact be used. But basically, the reason we don't have an ad hoc message 4 there currently is that in the text of the ad hoc draft, it says that if ad hoc message 4 is used, or if there's an error, then ad hoc message 4, then a response will be sent from the server as a response to message 3. But basically, the idea is that you may actually, it's not mandatory to have an ad hoc message 4. You can, in fact, omit that. So, well, anyway, the proposal is we merge this PR and we add a note to say that, okay, ad hoc message 4 is present in this example, but in general, it is optional. And we basically take the same text as is said in the ad hoc draft itself under an equivalent figure. And you see the figure there on the right-hand side. And the red part is the addition we're planning then. Yeah, just to summarize, next step. So the document is quite stable. It's aligned also with the latest ad hoc version, which is version 17. We have agreed to keep in sync and keep discussions, and depending on the state of the actual ad hoc document, to sync with the working group last call of that, which is actually concluded now on the 4th of November. And yeah, our proposal basically would be at this point to start the working group last call for this document also. Yeah, and that was the last slide. So, of course, any comments or feedback are well welcome, or reviews and other input. If not, I guess I will proceed to the next presentation. Right, so this is the second draft I want to present, and this is about the key update for OSCORE. Kudos, and we're now up to draft version number 3. And yeah, again, just to recap, I mean, basically this document has multiple subsections. One of the main sections, and where the document gets its title, is the Kudos procedure, which is a key update procedure for OSCORE. And the whole goal of that is to renew your master secret and master salt. And you also wish to derive new sender and recipient keys because you changed the master secret and master salt. That is the end result. So you have a fresh set of keys to continue communication with. And you may want to rekey for a variety of reasons. Benefits here is that you do not change your ID context, which is like an internal identifier of the OSCORE context. And you also achieve perfect forward secrecy with this procedure. It's loosely inspired by the Appendix B2 procedure that OSCORE defines for performing key update, but with a number of benefits over that one. The other main part is this part about AAD key usage limits for OSCORE, because it was discovered and is also defined in other documents like the CFRG draft you see on the bottom right, that if you have excessive usage of the same key, that may enable breaking some security properties of AAD algorithms. So what we want to do in this document is to define appropriate limits when using OSCORE, and the limits are really tied to what particular algorithm you're using. We also want to define concrete processing steps for messages, like what counters and keys should you use, and what you do when you reach the limits. And the final part is basically a section about updating OSCORE and sender and recipient IDs. Yep, next slide. So this is an overview of the keying procedure. It's pretty basic. It's a message exchange to exchange nonce as N1 and N2. And these are placed in a new field in the OSCORE co-op option. Then we feed this into this update CTX function that builds a new OSCORE security context for the pairs. And we also see a picture there of the way we extended the OSCORE option with new fields to hold the nonce and the X byte, and the X byte holds the length of the actual nonce and some flag bits. Yeah, and to go into a bit more detail on these flag bits and updates we did, so we updated the registrations regarding this. Bit 15, as before, indicates this is a Kudos message, and you have the presence of the nonce and the X byte. We also defined now that bit 0 instead of bit 1 should define that you have a second flag byte in the OSCORE option. And bit 0 really didn't have any concrete use case otherwise, so we took bit 0 for the extension. And this is also a point where Kudos will be updating the OSCORE RFC. We also changed the status of bit 1 from reserved to unassigned. And we also plan to register bit 8, 16, etc. as further extension bits to have a consistent pattern for extension. And this was all based on previous discussion on the mailing list and other meetings. We simplified the method for updating context. We used to have two internal code paths, one relying on the ad hoc key update, one relying on an extract and expand. And we discussed this at the core interim, and we said, okay, some feedback was why don't you just have method 2 based on the extract and expand, because there's no additional benefits from the ad hoc key update. So we have simplified this now. So we no longer have two separate code paths. We only go for the expand method, basically. You see in the green box there, that's the new style. Simplifies implementations, simplifies for building external values, There's no need for any fallback because previously it may have been the case that the adhoc key update was unavailable because the adhoc session wasn't valid anymore. So there's no need to signal that or kind of negotiate on that. You don't even have to support adhoc or be worried or think about if the original keys were established using adhoc. So this was a simplification without loss of security properties. Yeah. We also updated the update CTX function to not only rely on an HKDF. Previously, we specifically defined it to use HKDF expand. Now we generalize that to say that it should use kudos expand, which is like an interface to the key derivation function used by OSCORE. And this ensures flexibility and is also future-proof. I mean, typically OSCORE today will use an HKDF algorithm, and in such case, kudos expand is simply mapped to HKDF expand, as you see in the text there taken from the draft. However, a potential future update to OSCORE may define other KDFs, and in such case, that update can also define then a mapping between kudos expand and this new KDF. So we're future-proof in that sense. Yeah, another part that we did was define ways that you can use ad hoc to actually signal kudos support. So let's say that you actually do support ad hoc, you have ad hoc implemented between the pairs. Then when the pairs run ad hoc, they can use this EAD, which is basically optional data that can be exchanged during an ad hoc execution. And we defined EAD items for pairs to signal each other whether they support kudos or not and in which mode. So basically we register an EAD label and 4 possible values of this. And you can see there on the right-hand side on the table what these values are. So basically it can be ask, meaning you want to ask the other pair if it supports kudos. It's none, which indicates that me as the sending pair doesn't support kudos at all. It's full, meaning me as the sending pair supports kudos both in the forward secrecy mode and the no forward secrecy mode, or let's call it the stateless and stateful modes. And you can also indicate part, which means you only support kudos in the no forward secrecy mode. Yeah, I see Göran is in the queue there also. But you can also see on the left-hand side there a small example. Basically, when you indicate ask from the initiator, well, in ad hoc message 2, the responder would then indicate full, meaning I fully support kudos. And that's saying full in message 2 also is an indication to the initiator to indicate what it supports. So it will in turn respond with full. So after this ad hoc execution, both pairs know that they each other support kudos in both FS and no FS modes. Yes, please, Göran.
Göran Selander. Yeah, so my question was, do we need to signal this at all? Or, I mean, it will be understood by each party that we are, if one is proposing to run kudos or not.
It would, I mean, I would say that like, even if you didn't have this signaling, you could always do like a trial and error approach. So you try to run kudos with other pair and see if it works. So you would eventually learn, you could try and see if it fails, or you could try in the FS mode, and then the other pair may indicate, no, I don't support the FS mode, please retry in the no FS mode. So it's not something that kudos fundamentally relies on this functionality. It's like an extra nice feature that you may have this pre-established pre-knowledge after running ad hoc, so you don't have to go for the trial and error approach, but it's not a critical, and kudos doesn't rely on this basically. Okay, I think there's nice features and it's also adding complexity, so it's a trade-off there. Yeah, I think that's, thanks for the input. Yeah, I mean, definitely if this can be, then there's a trade-off, like you said. Is it worth the added complexity? I mean, this is again, it's if you have ad hoc supported, and even if you have support for ad hoc, this is not mandatory that you use. But yeah, thank you for the input. And further updates, yeah, we now forbid sending kudos messages during a kudos execution. We also indicate clearly that in the client-initiated version of kudos, the server must include a partial AV in its kudos response message, and I'll come back to that later. But basically, this prevents reusing the same pair of AED nonce and key in certain situations. And there's a later open point on how to generalize this for OSCORE overall. We clarified, we have this concept of a capable and non-capable device. So a capable device is more like a non-constrained device. Capable is a non-constrained device, and non-capable is a constrained device. And we now define clearly what mode of kudos they must support. So if you're a capable device, you must support forward secrecy mode, and you should support the no FS mode. But yeah, you can see in the draft, these concepts are basically related to if the device can write to persistent memory or not. We also restructured a section about reasons for rekeying and improved some parts regarding the retention policies of old contexts. Now I come to this point about partial AV responses. So basically, if you look on the figure to the right there, the blue arrow, you see that in that response 1, there's a partial AV 0. And we have concluded that the server must, in fact, include that partial AV in response 1. And otherwise it's not secure behavior. And why do you need to do this? Well, it's because you don't want to reuse the same AED nonce and key pair. So if you look at the table, you see that these are the request 1 and response 1 and request 2 and request 2 from the client and server point of view. And you see there, okay, let's say they use a nonce, placeholder value A, it just stands for a particular nonce. But the point here is that request 1 and response 1, basically the client will use a certain nonce, and the typical behavior is that the server mirrors and reuses the nonce from the request. So let's say it does that. Then following that, the client sends a request 2 using the same nonce. And you may, I mean, the thing here is that like from the client's point of view, the client switches context from context 1 to context new, right? So from the client's point of view, it's sending 2 messages with the same nonce, but it has different key, right? So it's completely fine. However, on the server side, server will send response 1 with CTX new and the mirrored nonce from the client, and it will also send response 2 with CTX new and the mirrored nonce from the client. And okay, you may say, why is the nonce the same? Well, because the CTX1 has become CTX new for the client, and then you reset your partial AV. And so fundamentally, the nonce would become the same. So essentially, to avoid this red line where we see that the same key and the same nonce is used, you need the server in response 1 to actually include a partial AV. And now, okay, the way we fix this now is just an ad hoc fix for kudos, but we want to define a more generalized fix to say that, well, this can also be a general fix for OSCORE itself, because anytime you transition between contexts like this, you will want to include your partial AV. So we have a proposal for text there saying that if an OSCORE response is protected with a different security context than the corresponding response, the corresponding request was unprotected with, the server must include its sequence number as partial AV. I see Christian in the queue also. And an exception is Appendix B2, because that is constructed in a way where it avoids this problem. Yeah, Christian?
Yeah, I think this is a very good thing to do, to just send the partial AV again.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Yeah, I think it makes sense. It's an easy way to solve this problem, but yeah, the problem is really like you will transition between contexts in the middle of a message processing, right? So you unprotect request 1 with one context, and you protect the response 1 with a different context, and you may run into this problem. But including the partial AV is an easy fix. Now I come to another question. So we discussed this in multiple earlier meetings about the future structure of this document. So as I mentioned, we have kind of multiple parts now. In sense, 3 parts: the kudos procedure, the limits, and then the OSCORE sender ID, recipient ID update section. So the question we'd like to bring up here is, should this be split out into a separate working group document, meaning the content about the limits? So we kind of try to summarize the feeling from the last core interim, where it was people expressed a strong preference to split this out. And the benefit there is that the limits document relies also on the document in C4G, and if we split this out, it can be updated independently based on what can happen in the C4D documents and such. So we got that impression that for limits part, there was a stronger consensus to split it out. Then a similar question comes for the method for updating the sender and recipient ID. This sender recipient ID procedure, it can be run either standalone or embedded in a kudos execution. So the question is, should we also split this out into a separate working group document? The consensus from the interim was, well, more a mild preference or people having no opinion regarding this. We still need a bit of work on this section, on preserving observations mainly. So our proposal here is to keep the part about sender and recipient ID update in the current document. And when we have that section more finalized, we come back to this. But on the limits, I would say we have our stance is that Connect should be split out today as a working group document. And the benefit of doing this split is basically like, well, then this document could in the future be focused only on kudos instead of, as it is now, having kind of 3 separate parts. Yeah, just quickly the main next steps. We want to address the open points that were discussed about this restructuring and also about the partial re-inclusion, more general text on that. Yeah, we got some good feedback from Rafa Marin Lopez on soft versus hard limits with kind of references to IPsec and how they have soft limits there. We want to expand the example about the OSCAR ID updates to provide textual description of the examples. And yeah, any comments or reviews are very welcome. And also feedback on this question about the future structure of the document and if we should split out, let's say, the limits part for now. Yeah, thank you. That was the full presentation.
Thanks, Richard.
Yeah, thank you.
Any comment, anyone? Well, I'm just curious because I didn't get it fully. What's the conclusion about the splitting, especially? Is it about following the plan suggested in the slide as is? Or is there any, you say so? So hard split of the limits for now, and we'll see.
Yeah, that would be
the
the
ID updates. Oh, there's Göran also in the queue.
Yeah, since you asked for feedback. So I
Yes.
think it's a good proposal to split out the limits and keep the sender recipient ID options in the kudos document.
Yeah, I think that makes sense for now. Like the limits can, we have more freedom to update. I see Carsten's coming up also, yeah.
Carsten Bormann, I had this experience just last Friday with a new student group who were looking at various ways to achieve a specific objective. And in the end, they looked at the 2 documents, one RFC and one internet draft, and said one has 70 pages, one has 90 pages. Let's implement the one with 70 pages. And I suspect that's not happening with students only. So I think we need to be a bit careful to not create documents that have the appearance of being complex by having stuff in there that you actually don't need to read to implement it.
I think that's a very good point, because if someone comes to this document only interested in the limits or only interested in kudos, then they may be misled to think that this is longer and more complex than it is, just because it has multiple independent parts, basically. So if we could split out the limits, it would make the document simpler and make the new AD limits document also simpler, definitely. So thanks for the feedback, yeah.
Okay, next is Martina with one presentation covering the last 2 slots, actually.
For my talk, I will talk about DNS over CoreOp in the first part, and then about the DNS message format using CBOR. These are two drafts. One is the working group draft for DOC, and the other one is currently a personal draft. First, of course, I speak about DNS over CoreOp. The motivation behind that, for those who still don't know, is that we want to have an IoT device that requests a name, and we want to protect against potential eavesdroppers. And a typical countermeasure there is to encrypt the name resolution. And with DNS over CoreOp, we would have such encryption, and additionally, we would also benefit from blockwise message transfer and the shared resource system resources of the CoreOp application, so we can use the same sockets and buffers, and reuse also the CoreOp retransmission mechanism. And since the last IETF, not that much has happened, except for, of course, the working group adaptation, but we added some security considerations on how ID 0 should be used in an unencrypted, or how the ID in general should be used in an unencrypted use. Then we replaced a layer violation where we stated something about con with a statement of fact that, well, if you use con, you don't need a retransmission mechanism. And we removed the doc server considerations, which were basically moved to its own draft, which a little bit I will discuss a little bit in the next steps also. Then there is some open discussion still on doc. We got some feedback from DNSOP. Thanks for that, by the way. So the first question was basically why it isn't just DOH via a CoreOp gateway. That the draft should explain that at least. Then we used a different TTL rewriting proposal that is different from the one in DOH. That should also be probably explained a little bit more in depth. Then there was a question if doc lives on a URI path. Of course it does. And if there is a default path that we can use as a common practice in CoreOp. So maybe something that some more CoreOp pros can answer. And then that is also something that was brought up by Carsten in the GitHub, that we need some recommendation how to bootstrap DOC with a service B record, where we probably need to allocate some ALMPN ID for CoreOp or DTLS. Are there any comments already on that maybe before I proceed? Okay, then I continue. So for the next step, of course, addressing the feedback is one big step. Then we still need to pick an ID for the application DNS message for content format. I guess I will just propose one. And for the other draft that was split out basically of that, you can have a look at that, but there was already some comments that it might not be that much of a added value, so maybe we can just leave it by the wayside. So we'll have to see about that. So thank you. That was basically the first talk. Are there any questions or comments? Yes, Christian?
Just a brief comment on the default path. While we don't usually do default paths, I would recommend that a server that is just a DNS server just place the lookup server resource at the / resource. It's like saving at least 2 bytes compared to every other message. And if it's a piece of software doing just that, then it can easily do that. There is nothing special about the / resource that's available, and why not use that?
I think I agree on that. So, yeah. Ben Schwartz?
Hi. So I think that is a perfectly reasonable recommendation, but the question here is it possible to bootstrap a DNS over CoAP connection without explicitly conveying a path? Because if it's always necessary to convey a path, then that places additional requirements on the bootstrap mechanism that is used. So for example, in the context of something like service bindings, you need a service bindings parameter that conveys the path, and that parameter always has to be present. The client can't probe for the presence of a DNS over CoAP server supported for DNS over CoAP on a CoAP server because it doesn't know what path to look at. This is all stuff that has come up with DNS over HTTPS, and there is no default path in DNS over HTTPS. We have this all working, but we've had to plumb through the path component through all of the bootstrap channels.
I guess Carsten has an answer for that.
Yeah, I think if we can emulate the HTTP here, then that's fine. I think it's important to keep in mind that in the constrained environment, the discovery will not necessarily run over DNS. It will often be in a resource directory. And there, of course, we can indicate the path because that's just part of the link that the resource directory provides. So one possible outcome, I don't know whether that's necessary, but one possible outcome would be to say for servers that use resource directory discovery, they can use any path. For servers that use a more limited form of discovery, they are stuck with the empty path.
Yeah.
So just one more suggestion on the table.
Yeah, Göran?
See who's next. Yeah. It's me. No, I was thinking about we could also reserve one of the /.wellknown something resources for that. And I've seen this also in other working groups that sometimes that's useful if you have a known resource path, because then in that case you can skip discovery processes. And in constrained networks, it's often, takes time, takes network resources to do this whole round trip of discover and get a response back. So if you can, typical situations, skip all of that and just make your message a little bit longer, it's not that many bytes. So it's also useful to have one of these well-known paths, because I'm not sure if we can assume that the server will, if you get an IP address and port, for example, through some way, but you don't get the resource. I don't think you can always assume that it's always at the /root resource, or maybe we can. Actually, there's a similar case we are working on right now in the Anima working group, where we also want to place something at the /resource. And there, the idea is what you discover is basically an IP address and a port, and you also know the purpose of that. So that's kind of a relay, co-op relay function, and then you also know by that the default resource is /. So that
I mean, we also have like the content format where we can basically tell the server, hey, I actually want this DNS resource, but maybe that's not a good idea. In our evaluations, we use DNS, but then again, we use 4 bytes in the header. So yeah, I guess that we need to put some thought into that more. Is the conclusion.
Yeah, but at least consider like one of those well-known paths, because a server can easily support multiple. So it could support the well-known one plus the discovered one, which may be the /resource. So it's fine to have multiple. And if you have something to fall back to, then if you already have an IP address and port where to go to, or maybe it's a default port, then you can just go and do the DNS request without needing to discover anything first. That's the idea.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, then let's continue with the second talk. which is about concise binary object representation of DNS messages or CBOR of this DNS messages. So the motivation is basically that we have a huge drawback of DNS and constraint messages, that if we look at the diagrams here, where on the x-axis we see for each name length a pair of queries and quad A responses, and on the y-axis the size of the packet with the fragmentation borders marked at as a dashed line, we see that we quickly, even for very short names, can exceed the fragmentation limit. So we need some way to compress our DNS messages. And yeah, that's basically the proposal we wrote, application /DNS plus CBOR. The idea behind it is that we reduce the packet size of DNS queries and replies by encoding them first in CBOR and then omitting redundant or unnecessary DNS fields in the DNS queries and responses. And then we also provide address and name compression using packed CBOR as an optional measure for the DNS responses. For DNS queries, you can see the definition of them in CDDL on the left side. For those who don't know that much CDDL, there's also an explanation on the right side. So basically a DNS query is a CBOR array, which at minimum contains the text string of the domain name, and it also optionally provides an ID and a record type specification. The ID defaults to 0 if it's not present, the record type defaults to quad A, and the record class to in if they are not present. The DNS resource record, which is then part of the response, is defined to also be a CBOR array, which at minimum contains a TTL and the resource data. And it optionally can also contain the name and the record type. And if both are not present, then they basically default to the question value. And a DNS response is an array of arrays, which at minimum contains the answer section, which again is an array of DNS resource records. But this basically generally assumes that the transport can map the query to the response, which, for example, for DOC or DOH is the case. But we can also provide the original question and the ID if that is not the case. Yeah, for a simple example, if we want to query the IPv6 address of example.org, we have this basically in CBOR diagnostic format represented here. This is then 13 bytes compared to the 52 bytes of wire format, which is a compression rate of 400%. And the corresponding response you can also see on the slide, which is only 24 bytes compared to the 68 bytes of the wire format compression of the wire format, which provides us with a compression rate of 284% or 3%. Yeah. For a more complex example, if we, for example, want to request the annual record of example.org domain, like we would do for DNSSD, then we get a good compression for the wire format still, but for the response, not so much. We have then 200 bytes of the CBOR format compared to the 195 bytes of the wire format. So we need some address and name compression, which with a little bit of Carsten's help, we provided. Yeah, for our proposal, we provide an optional CBOR support for the response, which is negotiated via content type or media type negotiation via this packed parameter for the media type. As a note, in version 1 of the draft, this is still its own media type, but in the next version, it will be a parameter. Yeah, and then we make a shared value and argument table one list instead of compared to the CBOR pack draft. And then basically the response becomes another array of 2 arrays, which the first parameter is the packing table, which is basically a combined shared value and argument table. And the second element is a compressed DNS response. The structure follows, of course, the uncompressed DNS response, but then is compressed. And if we look at our, and the question was that came up in other meetings was why we then don't use, for example, stuff like SHIC there. The problem is there that we basically have this SHIC, we have this assumed network structure, and somehow the rules for compression are exchanged between the device and the SHIC compressor decompressor. And so that the rule ID can be used for the identification of how this was compressed. And that basically means there must be an established connection between the device and the compressor and decompressor, which usually we don't have when we just select the DNS server with a DNS client. We can basically just select any DNS server there. So we don't have any agreed upon rules between the server and the client, except maybe for a few global compression contracts that we have in DNS, for example, the TLDs. So that is why we decided for the pack format. And to give you an example how this then would compress down is that we have this table on in the first array here, which is then referenced in the response itself. And even though in diagnostic format it looks much bigger than the original, if you compare that to actual CBOR, it's actually only 119 bytes. So we have a compression rate of 164 bytes percent. Sorry. Yeah. There's also maybe a way to how we can even more optimize that than if we use these global compression contexts I mentioned before, like the TLDs, to even elide more stuff, but maybe that's not that much worse of an effort. Yeah, but for the next steps here, we need to define some more details using packed CBORs. For example, we didn't define yet how the packing table is constructed. And yeah, again, the global compression context might also be a venue that needs to be discussed and thought upon. So yeah, thank you. And if you have any comments and questions, please ask them. Yeah, Benny?
So there have been a few attempts to re-express DNS over the past few years. And in general, I would say DNSOP has not been very friendly to these kinds of proposals. So I would say you should start by going to DNSOP and seeing what the DNS community makes of it. I think that the biggest concern there has generally been about ossification, the concern being that if a new format cannot express not only any DNS message that can be defined today, but any DNS message that will could ever be defined losslessly, if it doesn't meet that bar, then it is ossifying. It's creating devices that appear to do DNS, but actually only support a subset, creating problems for the evolution of DNS in the future. So that has been a concern. It's definitely something to think about. In general, I have trouble seeing the value here because DNS messages are almost always a tiny fraction of the total bandwidth. They're a bootstrap mechanism for something else. So saving even 50% off of the size of your DNS messages doesn't save you very much. It's not really measurable in aggregate.
I tend to disagree with that it's not that little of traffic, but yeah, we actually, of course, we want to go with DNS op into that. So yeah, but first, I guess we need to have the general format done before we go further into that. Esko?
Yeah, I was just considering that the normal DNS format has basically the packing already integrated there, so you can use it or cannot use it, but it's all the same format, and I think that's in general easier to handle. So you don't need to consider, oh wait, there's two formats, or I need to negotiate. So somehow I think it would be easy if you just one format where you can, where the client or basically the sender of the message can actually compress some things or decide to not compress things, and the receiver side will always be able to construct back the uncompressed message. So that would be useful.
The idea behind that is that the client might not support packed co-op, so that's a way. The negotiation part is basically a way for the client to say, "Hey, I support that, and if your response is quite large, then please send it back to me."
Okay, yeah, you just want to be sure that you can have clients that cannot do the decompression. Okay, yeah, and then one other just random remark is I have a system on my laptop running simulated wireless nodes that can talk DNS SD, so register services and query and things like that. So just to be aware of.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Carsten?
Yeah, just a quick answer to Ben. If you look at the percentage of the DNS traffic to other traffic, then of course the total gain of a concise representation is pretty limited. But I think as Martina had in her first slides, the environments that have limited PDU sizes actually have a cost for using larger packets that is going beyond just a few bytes. So the problem really is that you are using DNS when you're resetting, when you are recovering from a network failure, something like that. And that's exactly when everybody else does it, and your network will be impaired a little bit. And if then you actually have to do application layer fragmentation, so this is not IP fragmentation, but the adaptation layer that needs to do the fragmentation, you are further reducing your performance. So it would be nice if the actual DNS interchange would be as resilient as possible, and that makes it necessary to stay within about 80 bytes.
Yeah, and I mean, what you can see also on the slide is that larger packages also create more overhead because they also include the link and 6LoWPAN headers then, and so we want to try to avoid this. And again, okay.
Yeah. So if you're trying to stay under this limit deterministically, then I don't think a concise representation is sufficient, right? So like the path that seems more appealing to me is to say we're not providing a general purpose representation of DNS that's more compact, which is very difficult because the base representation is already very compact. What we're doing is defining a very simple service, like a name to IP service. You only get one IP back, very simplified, that could then serve this use case without claiming to be a general purpose replacement for DNS.
No, because we of course also want to support stuff like DNS service discovery, where we don't just want to resolve names to addresses, but also maybe other records. So I don't think a name to address service would just suffice for that.
I know we're over time. Even in that case, I would suggest just seeing if you could specify an API specifically for service discovery, and think of it as a service discovery system, not a DNS
Okay.
Can I ask a brief question? Hi, this is Matthias. I'm also co-author of this draft. Ben, I really don't understand your argument. Why are you arguing against the compression of the DNS messages? I mean, that the DNS is a rather tiny part of the overall traffic, okay, fine, but it's not an argument to not standardize or work on the compression of the messages.
So I do think it is, right? Like complexity has a cost. Defining new things with small benefits is not, I think, a good path forward in general. We should only take create all of this documentation and complexity if there's a significant payoff that actually benefits users in a meaningful way. But specifically in this case, I think that, as I mentioned, there are also some systemic concerns about alternative representations of DNS. So, for example, there's been a lot of effort to try to define JSON representations of DNS. And there are APIs out there that will give you DNS answers in JSON format. But standardizing that has been very challenging because it's not enough to specify a JSON format that represents DNS as it exists today. It needs to be able to evolve forward with any future uses of DNS, including things like eDNS options that have yet to be defined. So that raises the bar considerably. I do think that it's possible to define a representation of DNS messages that is a little bit smaller on average than the current messages. And certainly you can save a lot of space if you're willing to discard some of the information. But discarding DNS information is a very sticky area.
Yeah, Cosmo, I just want to say we already have a resource discovery service, so we don't need a new one. This really is about enabling DNS usage as it is being used in other environments, in the constrained environments as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good.
So yeah, just another comment on this. So what I work with is actually a constrained network implementation. So it's a thread wireless mesh network based on 6LoWPAN, but it's not the most constrained. So it still has the 2.4 gigahertz operation. So it can have a relatively large usage of the band. So no duty cycle limit. So I know there are even far more constrained types of networks, I think, than thread. But for thread, what we use is just the normal DNS. So for doing server lookups, but also DNS SD, so service registration and querying for services. So that's all done with, let's say, on embedded devices with the regular DNS format. So in that sense, I understand the argument a bit. Why would that? Yeah, why do things differently? Because we already have the DNS format, and it offers some form of compression. Maybe not the best, but it's in terms of traffic, it's not not the main source of traffic, you can say, for the applications. So I can understand that argument. So maybe it's good to think about, well, maybe there are even more constrained implementations where you have to be like in the single radio frame for common queries, like looking up a name to an IP address, which is the most common example. I'm not sure if those type of systems would actually go into service discovery, things like that. I don't know, but it's good to think about something that might be very compact for the bulk of the queries, which is like, okay, give me the IP address of this server, and maybe they are slightly more bulkier for complex things. Like if you have a DNS SD, maybe that just uses the existing encoding. I can also imagine that. So in that case, there's no problem that you hit a limit, that your new format cannot do everything that classic DNS can do. So that's also something to consider as well. So a bit of a hybrid approach in that case.
Yeah. So, are there? I think the queue is closed. So.
Yeah, we're going to first time and almost in the hour.
Yeah. So.
Thanks, Martina.
Yeah. Thank you.
And yeah, just to mention, we have an intermeeting already scheduled for November 23. The main topic should be HRF and target attributes, but there may be room also for continuing. So there's going to be an interim on November 23, already scheduled, and it's going to cover mostly HRF and target attributes. We can also continue this discussion on DNS CBOR. There's more interim already scheduled already. Till then, thanks everyone for attending and join the rest of IETF 115.
Just one thing I wanted to ask the chairs and the working group. This is Francesca. I have been going through the list of erratas, and there are currently 10 reported erratas, and I will post to the mailing list. I'm looking for agreement that this is the right way to mark them. So I will send an email shortly. Look out for that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Now that we have to show them